the Pentecostal movement, you had the Azusa Street revival, which if you go back and look at it, you had you had spiritualists and you had occultists who were in this thing. It was such a weird conglomeration of people. But once that ended and it started spreading throughout the United States, anybody who was there at the Azusa Street revival, they were seen as the godfathers, right? And whatever they said, it didn't matter what they said. They would take it as doctrine and it would enter into the Pentecostal faith. It doesn't even matter if this person is a Christian or not, as long as they're there and pretended to be Christian. Well, then William Branham dies. William Branham, who created the second wave. Well, Paul Cain is the godfather who was there. He was William Branham's mouthpiece, and he starts the third wave of Pentecostalism. Well, he gets this superiority among all of the others because he's the mouthpiece to Branham. And think of his rank among the entire group of men in the healing revivals. I can guarantee you every one of those other men were like, wait a minute, Paul Cain, who is he? Why is he this new leader? Well, Paul Cain's the guy that rose up, and he rose up because of his connection to William Branham.
Paul Cain is to the Kansas City Prophets what F.F. Bosworth was to the healing revival.
Right.
Okay? He's the old hand from the old days transmitting the stuff. So he's the bridge. He's the conduit, right, that pulls the ideas into the next generation of the movement. And so many of those other prophets were deeply influenced by Paul Cain. And a lot of what Mike Bickle and Bill Hammond and the other men implemented was in large part guided and influenced by Paul Cain. And whether they fully understood it or not, I don't know. It's possible they didn't know. But Paul Cain was teaching them things he had picked up from William Branham and the Latter Rain movement. Absolutely. And, when I listened to Paul Cain's recordings in the 1980s and 1990s, when all that stuff was in full swing, Paul Cain was teaching them pure Latter Rain manifested sons of God ideas, fivefold ministry ideas, positive confession ideas, right? He's teaching them all the core distinctives of the Latter Rain. Yeah. And then as the Kansas City Prophets dispersed and their influence went far and wide with them, they just spread these Latter Rain ideas everywhere. They just went far and wide. And a lot of people in these movements, I think, might just be totally unaware of the history of their beliefs. I mean, I think that's probably the truth. But ideologically, these guys are all cousins to the message. Yeah, in a lot of ways, they're the message minus William Branham. And their teachings and practices are very similar to the larger message sects, right? I mean, if we just didn't talk about William Branham, I'm sure we'd all get along just fine, right? We would generally be compatible in almost every other way.
Yeah. It's kind of funny when you step back from it, because William Branham was so purely evil that even while these men are together, they're trying to distance themselves from him, but they can't, because he's the guy that everybody's coming to see. He's the entertainment, right? And they're wanting to get away from this guy because they realize he doesn't even know the Bible, and he's preaching, which is really odd when you think about it. And they try to separate themselves, but they can't. And so after he dies, they all try to disconnect as though that never happened. Don't look behind the curtain at the guy that created our movements. That never happened. Let's just erase it.
So one of the figures from the Kansas City Prophets was a man named John Wimber, and he was a key figure in the Vineyard movement. And the Vineyard movement is where the Toronto Blessing happened. So, if you know, probably most of our listeners have heard about that. And the Vineyard movement, I think they might be the largest group of charismatic churches in the world today. I could be mistaken, but they're right there with the largest group, I would say. They've got thousands of churches globally, and they're even larger than the Message. They're in some ways a branch out of Calvary Chapel. In some ways, you could kind of classify the Vineyard movement as Calvary Chapel with a dash of Kansas City Prophets added in, right? They're more ecstatic in their worship. There's more emphasis on those gifts of the Spirit, and the stuff I would say that Calvary Chapel reformed out, the Vineyard movement has that in spades. I'll put it that way. And so, and another group besides them that came out of the Kansas City Prophets was it's called the International House of Prayer, and that was started by Mike Bickle. And I think it's fair to say Mike Bickle was the leader of the Kansas City Prophets. He's actually the one who discovered that Paul Cain was visiting homosexual prostitutes. And
you got the International House of Pancakes and the International House of Fruitcakes.
the IHOP actually sued them. International House of Pancakes actually sued them over. Yeah, so funny stuff. But the International House of Prayer is very influential today. They're still very influential today. And then the last group coming out of this I want to mention, there's more than we're talking about, but the last group is the Christian International Apostolic Network. And that was started by Bill Hammond, who was another one of the Kansas City Prophets. And that movement has built a global network of apostles and prophets who are probably the most intense group, I'll use the word intense, to come out of the Kansas City Prophets. They embrace variations of the manifested sons of God ideas, fivefold ministry ideas, word of faith ideas, positive confession ideas. Most of the core of the things that we believed in the message exist in all their groups in a slightly evolved form. And Paul Cain was the bridge for transmitting those ideas to those men.
Yeah. I mean, you look back at how all of these groups came together and came to be, and you can find traces of William Branham's quote-unquote message through all of them. And when you take that timeline forward, it's really hard to believe that it still exists and how widespread it is, because elements of the very wrong things that William Branham introduced into Christianity have just kind of, it's like this big pane of glass that just shattered and splintered and went into, infected the rest of the church. And not everybody is aware of where this history came from. And so you'll find very, very good Christian groups that actually spread the gospel, that have reformed, and they've become somewhat stable, but they have the roots in this. And so, unfortunately, you may sit through a sermon and you may hear very, very good gospel preaching with just this little seed of something that came from the latter rain revivals.
You know, I really wonder, when Mike Bickle discovered that Paul Cain was visiting the homosexual prostitutes, did it ever run through their mind that maybe that guy had been tricking them all along, and they should probably go back and cut out all the stuff that he taught them? You know, do you think that ever ran through their mind? I don't think it did. They basically threw Paul Cain to the curb and then kept all of the stuff that he taught them in practice. I guess they were too far along at that point. I don't know.